is Sarah McCord. This site here is the Jornada's National Wind Erosion Research Network site. I'm going to let Sarah talk for about 10 minutes about the Jornada's involvement in national monitoring programs, and then we'll walk up a bit closer to the site and I'll talk about the equipment, what we're doing with the network, and how that relates to the monitoring.
Great, thanks Nick. As Nick said, I'm Sarah McCord. I'm an ecologist here at the Jornada. And what I want to follow up on today is a lot of what Brandon was talking about. We have these landscape changes, we have drivers and pressures that are new or maybe ongoing, and we're trying to understand them. And the way that we try to understand these landscape dynamics is through collecting data about these ecosystems. And the Jornada has been on a long effort to collect data about ecosystems and then translate that into information and then management actions following on from that. The Jornada has worked with a number of land management agencies and ranchers and producers to develop a suite of data and information about ecosystems that we can use across dry lands. The methods that have been developed in the packet works in the Chihuahuan Desert. We can collect meaningful ecosystem information in the Chihuahuan Desert and up in the Alaskan tundra. And so it's a fairly neutral data collection system. It's also a system where it's easy to train different data collectors and have them calibrated, and so that we can make sure that I'm collecting data the same way that Nick is collecting data, the same way that all of you might be collecting data. And so what are we collecting as part of this standardized monitoring data set? Well, so the core methods that have been adopted by the Bureau of Land Management's Assessment, Inventory, and Monitoring, or AIM program, and the NRCS National Resources Inventory program are line point intercept, canopy gap, vegetation height, in addition to a species inventory and sometimes soil stability. And so with all of this, in addition to digging a soil pit at the plot location, we're getting a lot of information about the biotic integrity of the landscape, the soils, and the hydrologic function, and how resilient these systems might be. So today, across the western United States, between NRCS, BLM, and some of the Jornada projects that also use these methods, we have well over 50,000 plots that have collected these data. And so we're starting to have a wealth of information about ecosystems that spans ownership, it spans data collectors, and now we can start to ask some really interesting questions about what's going on these landscapes, how well are they responding to our management efforts. And then from that, what are the methods that we can use to collect data that informs those indicators? And so the line point intercept method, many of you may be familiar with this. It's been around since the 1920s, but it was really honed and perfected here at the Jornada with over several generations of researchers. The vegetation height method was also piloted and developed here, as was canopy gap, and all of those together get us at some core information about ecosystems. So all of these are described in the monitoring manual for grassland, shrubland, and savanna ecosystems. The methods are described in detail. A number of the Jornada research programs also rely on these methods. Restore New Mexico, LTAR uses these methods. The Wind Erosion Network, as Nick will talk about later. A wealth of information with fairly low effort required from those asking the questions. General land health and land condition in permit renewals, developing range management plans, and these are being combined then with ecological sites. And so with knowing the potential for ecological sites, we could say, okay, we have 15% bare ground across this ecosystem. Well, what does that really mean? For some ecological sites, 15% bare ground is fine. For others, that's indicative of we have a problem. We have an invasion of species or some other issue that we need to manage for. And so what we have been working with folks to do is to then develop benchmarks of, okay, we know this is the indicator value of the land. Is that good, bad, indifferent? We can say, are we meeting our desired management benchmark of 10 to 20% bare ground? Is that a yes or a no? And then we can start saying, okay, well, how much of this landscape is meeting or not meeting our management objectives? And a lot of times those benchmark values are coming from ecological sites. The standardized monitoring efforts in the Jornada has been partnering with Mongolia, but it's also been really useful for the managers in the Southwest in understanding what are the drivers of change and the effects of these changes on the landscapes that we're managing.
I'm Nick Webb. So we're now sort of near the middle of the Jornada's Wind Erosion Network site, and I'll tell you a bit about the network and why we established it, what kinds of data we collect and what we're doing with those data. So the Wind Erosion Network is really a fairly big multi-partner collaboration involving the USDA's ARS, including the Long-Term Agro-ecological Research Network, LTAR network, the BLM, the NRCS, Department of Defense through both Army Corps of Engineers, Holloman Air Force Base and the Army Research Laboratory at White Sands, and the Nature Conservancy. We established the network to really address some big challenges that we have in aeolian or wind erosion research. And those challenges are that over the course of time, people haven't used any sort of standardized instrumentation or methods in their research, which has made it very difficult to generalize our understanding of wind erosion processes across ecosystems. People have tended to use sampling designs to measure wind erosion processes that really lack any sort of statistical rigor. So putting 1 or 2 sediment samplers out in a field, choosing where you put them, that kind of thing is very common. And that has really limited our ability to be confident that changes that we're measuring in response to management and ecosystem changes are in fact real. Because it's so hard to measure wind erosion processes in the field, we tend to rely on numerical models to simulate the processes. But we have a number of challenges there. So the USDA has for a long time invested in the development of wind erosion models for croplands, but it hasn't given so much attention to the processes in rangelands. And it's very difficult to model wind erosion in rangelands because of the complexity of the vegetation. The structures of it, the fact that we've got grasses, shrubs, physical soil crusts, biological crusts, all make the system very complex to model the processes in. So we don't have particularly good models. The models that we do have only really been tested in croplands under sort of ideal conditions, so like a big, bare, flat, open field. And models haven't really been tested in vegetated landscapes, across different ecosystems or under different management systems. So we don't really know what the uncertainty is associated with wind erosion model outputs, which means that it's very difficult to incorporate wind erosion information into management decisions. So those challenges are what we're looking to address with the Wind Erosion Network. And to do that, we have a large number of sites. We have 10 sites at the moment that are sort of operational, with another sort of 6 or 7 due to come online. These are spread across croplands and rangelands, from sort of conventional till croplands to no-till rangelands that are like this, sort of mixed grass shrublands to grasslands to shrublands. And we've selected the sites across the western states to really capture the range of sort of soil properties and different vegetation types and structures that we know will really challenge our understanding of wind erosion processes and challenge our ability to model them, so that we can push our science forward in understanding and modelling the processes. So a really key thing that we have with the wind erosion sites is that we've adopted standardised instrumentation, data collection methods and sort of data management and analysis methods. So each of the network sites like this is a hectare, so it's 100 by 100 metres. We have a 10-metre meteorological tower in the middle with some fairly basic instrumentation that we have at all of the sites. So we have anemometers that are measuring a wind speed profile and temperature sensors up the tower. So from that information we can look at sort of something about the atmospheric stability. The wind speed profile will tell us something about the aerodynamic roughness of the landscape. And from that we can estimate what the wind energy is, or the shear stress, the friction velocity of the wind at the soil surface. And we can relate that to the distribution of vegetation around the site. We use a stratified random sampling design to measure the sediment transport at the site, sort of a little map of what the network sites look like. So we just use a regular 3x3 grid to divide up the site, and then we randomly locate 3 of these sediment sampler masts, like the one in the little fence here, within each of those grid cells. These are called modified Wilson and Cook samplers, or MWAC samplers, and they're a passive sampler, so the sediment blows over the surface into the tubes on the front. It has a wind vane, so it will always point into the wind, and that captures what we call sort of a mass profile of the sediment that's being transported. So we can weigh the amount of sediment in the traps, we can calculate the total sediment moving through that column, and we can look at its spatial variability over the site because we have this stratified random sampling design. And that has proven to be really powerful in detecting change in transport at the sites over time and understanding how the spatial distribution of vegetation at the sites influences the spatial patterns of sediment transport. So ultimately what we'd like to get to with these sites is measuring the net wind erosion, which includes this transport, so the emission from the site and through the site, deposition from upwind, and what's leaving not just as sort of large sand grains that are bouncing along the surface, but also the really fine dust that can affect health, visibility, highway safety, those sorts of things. So through a collaboration with the Army Research Laboratory of White Sands, we have the samplers on the mast in those 2 white boxes there. Those are called dust tracks, and they're laser photometers that measure really fine particulate matter concentrations. So PM10, PM2.5, the stuff that you can breathe in essentially. So by measuring these dust concentrations at 2 heights and knowing something about the wind speed profile or the friction velocity of the wind, we can calculate what the dust flux is. So the flux of really fine particles moving vertically off the surface. We can also look at the dust deposition onto the site. We have a T-post just inside the plot here with a cake pan on it and some spikes on the top. And that's a fairly basic dust deposition trap. And so dust will settle into that. We can rinse out the sediment and weigh it and get an estimate of how much dust is being deposited into the site. And we have those randomly located over the area as well. So all the sites in the network are instrumented in this same sort of way with the same equipment, same sensors. We also have 3 100-metre vegetation transects that we measure 4 times a year over the sites using the core methods that Sarah described. So the data that we collect describing soils and vegetation at the sites are directly compatible with those collected by the NRCS and the BLM in their AIM and NRI monitoring programs. And the idea is that we use the data that we collect at these sites to calibrate and develop physically based wind erosion and dust emission models that we can then apply directly to these monitoring data. So by linking our numerical model with the data that Sarah was talking about, we can now produce estimates of sediment transport and dust emission at the plot scale to the national scale. We can then look at relating wind erosion rates to ecological site descriptions, state transitions. We can identify benchmarks for wind erosion management for different ecological sites. And we can start to look at how different management activities might be impacting erosion rates and the sort of co-benefits of management options for if we do something that might reduce wind erosion, then will that have benefits for production, for wildlife, those sorts of things.
Is there a website?
Yeah, so we have thanks Joel, we have a website, winderosionnetwork.org. We have descriptions of all the sites. A big part of the network is making the data publicly available. So all the meteorological data are available and all the data from the sites are available to anyone collaborating with us. So we really want to get this data out there and used by the wider community.